Now I need to mention something regarding this scene with Salieri's opera. It's very obvious that it's the same opera we see at the beginning when we first see Salieri at the beginning of the flashback, which basically contradicts what I said in part 1. And then to see Salieri in this happy state, simply enjoying his own music and not seeming to be bothered by anything. It's a great way that the status quo of Salieri's life story has been set up. Even though this opera was actually written 3 years before Mozart's death, it seems safe to assume in this story that this is an opera he is performing before Mozart came to Vienna, especially considering Katharina, the opera singer, is here, and her and Salieri already know each other when we see her again, and then after that we never see her until Mozart's funeral. So this truly is Salieri in his element, enjoying the success he has as a composer. The thing is, I still think what I said is supposed to be true. Let me explain. The way I see it is, I think the filmmakers knew that this scene was only going to be one shot, and so they thought it would be a waste of money to create an entirely different opera set for just this one scene, when they could just use the same set from an opera that's used later on in the film. I kind of think we're not supposed to know it's the same opera, since as a first-time viewer we'd most likely would have forgotten what this shot specifically looked like. I think we are being made to assume that it was an opera performed before he even met Mozart, but that's just my view. But I totally think the other possibilities still make sense, and I still agree that it could equally be the case as well. That this is the same opera in the context of the story, but that when Salieri recalls that specific opera, he purposefully ignores the dark side underneath the surface. What I'm trying to say is, when Salieri is performing the opera, he's in a very intense state of envy, and this scene is him putting in all he can, specifically to impress Mozart. He has fallen in love with Mozart's music, and especially under the assumption that he believes God gave him this talent. So I see it as a rather uncontent moment of his life. I don't know if that's a word. But if you'll notice, after this opera is finished, the Emperor states that his opera is the best opera yet written.
I believe it is the best opera yet written, my friends.
And so while Salieri doesn't believe that, in his old age, he likes to hang on to that memory. The memory that yes, he was loved in his time. It's just not good enough because he knew he wasn't as good as Mozart. And in his old age, Mozart had surpassed him in reputation and legacy.
Yes, I know that.
But Salieri still gets a little shred of happiness over that memory of being told that his opera was the best. And so that's possibly why he plays this memory of this specific opera in the beginning of the film. The fact is, when we see this shot in the beginning, we see him as a happy, peaceful, content being. But when it gets to that part of the story, we realize there was something buried underneath the surface. Okay, moving on. Salieri's opera finishes, and as I just said, the Emperor declares it to be the best opera yet written. Salieri clearly cares way more about Mozart's opinion though.
Did my work please you? I never knew that the music like that was possible. You flatter me. No. One hears such sounds, and what can one say but Salieri?
And when Mozart says this, he knows what that means. Mozart's clear tone of sarcasm came through to Salieri, which has deeply hurt him. So later that night, Mozart and Schikaneder come home from an after party in which they both got moderately drunk. They come home to Constanza, who is holding their probably newborn baby, to highlight how much Mozart has gone downhill in terms of his responsibilities because of his drinking problem. Also at Mozart's house is 2 men who literally look like vampires, which is a very nice touch considering the subject matter of this scene.
These gentlemen are from Salzburg.
Salzburg? We were just talking about Salzburg.
Wolfie, your father is dead.
The scene swiftly comes to an end when Constanza announces that the men have come to tell her that Mozart's father had died. I love the almost trivial way these scenes are so short. It keeps it to the point, draws you into the story, keeps you on your feet, and not one moment ends up forgotten. It's also very important how this film goes from Marriage of Figaro to Alexandre Dumas to Don Giovanni. Mozart makes art that is beautiful and happy and whimsical. Salieri falls in love deeper and subsequently seeks validation from Mozart. Salieri does his opera and can tell that Mozart was not impressed. Mozart comes home from a night of fun, probably also making fun of Salieri. He quickly, without hesitation, discovers his father is dead, and we cut straight into the output that Mozart creates out of the feeling he felt over his father's death. Had the operas not been so close together and spread out between more scenes instead, we may have not been able to put the two together, that these things are all connected. The fact that the art is created as a part of who you are and how you feel, that the art that you admire can also affect your life intensely. Salieri sees Marriage of Figaro, he needs validation from someone he regards as the greatest. Salieri sees Don Giovanni, he starts his plot to kill Mozart. I should also point out something I mentioned in part 1, that when we see the portrait of Mozart's father, we don't hear the same part of music from these scenes. This is being used as a kind of death motif. We hear it 3 more times in the film, I think. To me, this chord difference feels like a way of conveying nuanced feelings as opposed to definite feelings. If we go back to the beginning, we can hear this D minor being played.
I like writing in D.
It's confirmed horror, sadness, trauma. There is no complexity in what emotion is being expressed here. We hear it as the film begins, and we are introduced to a screaming Salieri who's been living in distress for many years. We hear it again when Mozart sees his father, essentially the creator and cause of this entire story. If it hadn't been for his selfish, exploitative ways, Mozart wouldn't have a drinking problem. We hear that same sound again when the dark figure who commissions Mozart to write a requiem shows up. But before that, we hear this, when Leopold has died. This isn't a D minor, this is, if I'm not mistaken, a B diminished chord. I may be wrong, but what's certain is that the notes we are hearing do not make a regular minor chord. Diminished chords, while they definitely sound more sad than happy, it's still a kind of confused sound. Mozart has conflicting thoughts regarding the death of his father, and it's coming out in this opera, which is both a tribute to the pain he feels because of his father's death, but also the anger he has felt towards his father whilst he was alive. It's also a sign that Mozart has been far more self-aware than we were led to believe. And that while he may come across as a simple, happy composer, there's still a troubled philosopher underneath that has come to truly understand the depth that goes into the state of being human. It's clear that Mozart loved to read librettos and stories and had a very good understanding of storytelling, and he strikes me as a Stanley Kubrick type, in the sense that he reads tons of stories and is very good at picking the ones that connect with him, and that he knows he can make his own. This is also something Salieri truly realizes when he watches Don Giovanni. Upon researching the story of Don Giovanni, it strikes me as something I assume Sparks based their story Annette on, and even more so when you take into account the comparison to Mozart and his father. Only the story in Annette is slightly more light-hearted in the end. In Annette, Adam Driver's character is a terrible, domineering person. He exploits his child for money and fame, but when he's confronted in court by the ghost of Anne, he starts to feel remorse, and from that point on we can truly feel his sorrow, his shame and guilt.
Stepping back in time, I could step aside, not allow my rage to be magnified.
To the point where by the end, we can really feel sorry for him.
But his forgiveness is so
This horrid urge to look below.
it always gone so far astray.
God knows I tried to fight it off, half horrified and half relieved.
Heart,
Because my eyes down the earth.
shore. Now you have nothing to love.
Why can't I love you? Can't I love you?
Now you have nothing to love.
Can't I love you, Annette?
In Don Giovanni, Don never feels remorse when he's confronted by the dark figure. He never repents, and he's taken away to hell by demons. So what we assume from this opera is that Mozart is portraying his father through Don Giovanni, using this story to represent the abusive, exploitative, and restrictive way he raised his child, possibly leading him to a life of alcoholism and emotional immaturity. I actually think Mozart's father did feel remorse, and it's clear from this scene that he recognizes he didn't raise him well.
But your grace, I assure
Your son is an unprincipled, spoiled, conceited brat.
That is the truth. But don't blame him. The fault is mine, entirely.
But Mozart most likely finds it hard to understand this, or maybe has no idea he ever felt this, and his childhood troubles are simply too intense for him to see things clearly. But anyway, the point of seeing this is that it's really letting Salieri into Mozart's complex mind and philosophy. Salieri ends up seeing all 5 performances of Don Giovanni, and the audience gets smaller and smaller as Mozart fades into obscurity. Salieri sees the truth about who is the most talented composer in Vienna. Fun fact, something that had been mentioned before is this theatre is the theatre that Mozart actually did perform Don Giovanni in. It's in Prague, not Vienna, but this is still exactly where Don Giovanni was performed. I think it's safe to assume that in this fictionalized story, we are seeing that operas commissioned by the Emperor are all performed in the same Royal Opera House in Vienna, and then when we see the next 2 operas, we are seeing them be performed in Emanuel Schikaneder's theatre. Anyway, moving on. We actually get to see a big portion of the ending of this opera, to really submerge ourselves into Mozart's skilled composing and meaningful artistry as it relates to his own personal feelings. After this scene ends, we see that Vienna has been struck by snow. I see this as something both representing the oncoming illness that Mozart is soon to have, but if you remember about the snow in the beginning, it's also a metaphor for the depression from pure envy Salieri has truly come to feel as a result of seeing Don Giovanni. Salieri's servant enters a costume shop to collect a dark figure suit for him, the same very suit that Leopold wore to the masquerade, and we can also make comparisons to the statue in Don Giovanni. The Don Giovanni overture once again plays as he appears at Mozart's house. After After Mozart has created Don Giovanni as revenge on his father has come back to Mozart to commission a requiem. Salieri uses the context from that opera to scare Mozart into being under his control. Salieri uses this familiar image that reminds Mozart of his father to once again domineer and control Mozart. What must be going on in Mozart's mind would be very complex. Struck with traumatized confusion over this dark figure who appears to me and asks me to write a requiem for someone but won't tell me who, and I just happen to perform Don Giovanni to reflect my father? Could this be that this is the ghost of my father coming back to tell me to properly pay tribute to him? I like that Mozart's actual thoughts or suspicions aren't clear at all, because they aren't very clear. This is a very odd situation to happen, but we do know that it's a very scary situation. It's also a very disturbing sight to see him then glance at the portrait of his father, as the possibility of a phantom starts sending his mind into rumination. He also looks out the window and sees children playing, a symbol of life and innocence, a symbol of Mozart, and then when he checks again, the kids are gone. And all we see is Salieri and a carriage, and while Mozart might not realize it just now, he will soon come to feel as though this requiem is somehow killing him. Maybe the requiem isn't for Leopold, maybe it's for his own demise. Present day Salieri utters something intense.
First I must get the death mass, and then I must achieve his death.
The priest is shocked by this. It seems this entire time he had never truly thought that Salieri killed Mozart, and that perhaps it was just mad mutterings. But to actually start talking about scheming Mozart's death, this is what is making it far too real for the priest. Salieri fantasizes this ideal situation that would benefit him.
First I must get the death mass, and then I must achieve his death. What? His funeral. Imagine it. The cathedral. All Vienna sitting there. His coffin. Mozart's little coffin in the middle. Music. A divine music bursts out over them all. A great mass of death. Requiem Mass for Wolfgang Mozart, composed by his devoted friend, Antonio Salieri. Salieri has been touched by God at last, and God forced to listen. Powerless to stop it. I, for once, in the end, laughing at him. The only thing that worried me was the actual killing. How does one do that? How does one kill a man? It's one thing to dream about it. Very different when you have to do it with your own hands.
That's such a Shakespearean moment there. It's absolutely breathtaking and tragic. I didn't need to explain that, you already knew that.
The only thing that worried me was the actual killing.
The way the music doesn't cut abruptly like when he abruptly cut the Marriage of Figaro piece in this transition, it shows us that Salieri has a more defined control and balance over this requiem music, which he does, since he is the commissioner. He takes care of this piece because he desires for it to be his. We can see that Salieri is having trouble figuring out exactly how he would kill Mozart, and so for that reason, after this scene, we actually don't see him for a while. It's as if he has drifted off into the shadows, scheming in private, as Mozart lives his life, ironically also killing himself with his drinking problem, which is getting evidently worse. We are brought to Emanuel Sciccanida's opera house. Simon Callow is an actor named Simon Callow. Sciccanido was known as one of the greatest theatre men. He also wrote the libretto for The Magic Flute, and we see here that he is putting on a comedy show, making fun of Mozart's operas. We start by seeing a piece from Don Giovanni, seeing how this tragic story of death and revenge is being mocked and belittled. Except these are dwarfs, which to an audience of the 18th century would have obviously been a funny thing to see, and not something that would be considered offensive.
He liked the little people, didn't he?
But Sciccanido and also Milos Forman are definitely more considerate about giving them roles than, say, Disney.
It's no longer 1937.
I love how this scene reminds me a lot of the nonsense stuff that happens in The Holy Mountain. It's actually quite trippy and a nice little insane comedic release from the tragedy of the main plot. It also kind of reflects how Mozart is seeing life right now in his constant state of intoxication. Now I know I said that Mozart's work is being mocked and belittled in this opera, but what we can also see is that clearly Emmanuel does admire Mozart's work, and more so, we see that the audience here also admires Mozart's work, which is a huge turnaround from the Emperor's commissioned operas, in which Mozart was being admired less and less by the rich people in Vienna.
I'm sick to death of that tune!
It seems that Emmanuel's tribute to Mozart might have been helping to bring his music to the more middle and lower classes. Through this parody, we see that everyone in this audience is singing along to all these amazing Mozart melodies. It feels like a Danny Boyle film. To hear this large, reverberated sound of adoring fans who love to sing and react and dance, rather than sit still like the prim and proper people at the Emperor's Opera House. We can see that Mozart is fine with this mockery. He simply wants to laugh at this point, and since the Emperor has pretty much stopped appreciating him, he learned to find joy from whomever else would appreciate him, which is definitely a good thing. But Constanza on the other hand feels as though this is too far in the direction of becoming poorer and poorer. If Mozart is paid to perform for common people, will they get paid enough to continue living like royalty? It's obviously a bit of a selfish way to look at life, but given the fact that Mozart is so irresponsible with his money, it makes sense that she would desire for them to have a bigger and more reliable source of income. Mozart and Constanza have always been young and immature at heart, and so these views, be them slightly controversial, are still very realistic and something we can definitely empathize with. After the show, Schikaneder comes to talk to Mozart about commissioning an opera, The Magic Flute. Constanza asks about the money. He suggests paying later. Constanza then says, now. Schikaneder laughs at this, suggesting he doesn't have good money to pay, which gives Constanza more of a suspicion that he isn't trustworthy. But Mozart simply averts the situation by doing this.
You'll never see a penny. I want it here in my hand.
I'll put it here.
Shut up! You won't put a thing in my hand until I see some money.
That's embarrassing.
Salieri talks with Van Swieten in a library. Salieri tells him and us that Mozart has been alienated by all of Vienna, and so we cut back to the dogman, who Salieri introduced to him, and Mozart uses him as a last resort for money, very drunkly stumbling in and asking if his daughter needs lessons. The man says no, and Mozart is shown out, vaguely trying to flirt with the maid. See how I mentioned before that inside Mozart's work, he usually stays professional, and throughout the film, his working mode becomes more and more professional, whilst his personal life became more wild and crazy. Well, now we see this wild, crazy life has seeped into his professional life, and whereas before we would see Mozart acting as serious as he could, here he has lost any sense of that. I like how these two scenes back to back tell their own story. The ruckus of the lesson causing a rich and successful composer to turn to drinking, then he returns having become a sad, unemployed alcoholic with an illness, asking if he could teach lessons again.
Siamo tutti morti quando dico non si pasce dicevo mortale che si pasce dicevo
parla ovunque, le membra fermar più, che chiedi, terzana da bene mi sembra, le membra fermar più non so.